right. Okay, we're live on YouTube with Gary Gruver. So want to welcome everyone to the DevOps Online Meetup. And so we have, like I mentioned, we have Gary with us. I also want to thank Gary. He's going to give away a copy of his Engineering the Digital Transformation away. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat so everyone can register for that. But we appreciate Gary joining us here and having a little fun with us. So we're going to talk a little bit about some struggles. So Gary, if you want to just introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about some of those struggles, because I know you're dealing with people and organizations all the time on kind of working through our DevOps journey and really helping them with those struggles, aren't you?
Yeah, I started this, I don't know, before DevOps was DevOps, I was at HP and I had a big problem with the LaserJet firmware, and we started kind of just doing continuous improvement and trying to figure out how to get better each day. And at the end of 3 years, we pretty much transformed completely how we did the business, and probably a 2 to 3x improvement in productivity, and took firmware from being the bottleneck for the business to an enabler. And it was a breakthrough event. And kind of was so excited about it. I talked to my program manager, we got to write a book, and we wrote it. And that started me down this path of continuing to learn more stuff and trying to share it with others through books. And Engineering the Digital Transformation that I'm giving away is the 4th book. And I spent all my time since then trying to figure out how to help people transform and realize the benefits of the types of things that we got at HP. Yeah. And kind of my latest focus is more on organizational change management, because the technology's evolved, it's gotten pretty mature, and the challenge is really getting people to invest in improvements and embrace new ways of working.
So talk to us a little bit about that, Gary. As you mentioned, that organizational improvement, that can be kind of the hard stuff. I know a lot of times, as a technologist myself, I like to focus on the technology, but it's the organizational structures and people involved and the procedures that really are the tough stuff, aren't they?
I think so. As I deal with more and more organizations, you can talk to people that are excited, you can roll out technology, you can buy tools, but if you can't get the people to invest in implementing them, and you can't get people to embrace the new ways of working, you're just going to hit a dead end. And I spent a lot more time recently doing research on organizational change management for that reason. I came across the work of, I don't know if you've heard of the Catalyst book by Johan Berger.
Tell us about that one.
He's a professor out of the Wharton School of Business, and he's been doing one. He basically says that most of the things I see being done in the industry are the wrong things if you're trying to influence change. The more you try to force people or convince people, he says they really kind of come up with the Antipersuasion Radar, where everybody kind of puts a hand up and says, the more you try to convince me, the more I'm going to dig in and the harder I'm going to resist. And he's got a bunch of steps that you take to avoid that. But a big part of it is, letting people pick and letting them come up with their choices. And my latest approach I've really gone is I've shifted away from books and writing, trying to convince people to trying to teach them, and then trying to convince them to do some sort of an improvement project. And then letting them pick what that is based on where they're at in their journey. And he talks a lot about you've got to be within the zone of acceptance of people. If you're talking to a mainframe group that's done something the same for 30 years, and you're trying to convince them to be like a web Java app that's sort of releasing, 20 times a day, it's so that they're just going to check out, and they're not going to be signed up for it. So you gotta let them pick something to get started on their continuous improvement journey that's closer to where they currently are, and start down that path. And I've got a white paper I wrote that sort of the top 10 ANA patterns of organizational change management. If you'd like to send that out to everybody who sort of logged in here, it kind of talks about his book, which has influenced a lot of the way I do things these days, because I'm trying to deal with that hard challenge of how do you get people to embrace these changes. So I can send that out, and send me an email of who wins the book, and I'll get you a free book on that. And then I started more, I turned my last book into computer-based training program, which is really around here's how you teach people how to think about software and development delivery as a process that can and should be continually improved. And here's how to analyze your processes. And it's not something we've done in software that much. And then enable them to pick the things that they think will make the most difference.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like, you touched on a lot of good stuff there. I think, Gary, I like the zone of acceptance, because I think a lot of times we try to, kind of like the term, boil the ocean. We try to make all this change, but it's not palatable to, like you said, maybe a mainframe group, or maybe, whatever group we're talking to. We kind of have to think about what change looks like to them. Right.
Yeah. And maybe it worked for somebody else that had a different problem in a different situation. And whether it's agile or whether it's DevOps, frequently we're saying, well, everybody should do this because it worked for this group. Well, I may have a different problem, right? I may, like at the LaserJet business, we did no deployment. So this whole idea of, deploying hundreds of times a day, do you want me to be upgrading your LaserJet firmware 100 times a day, or do you care? Or we had different problems, but solve a problem that matters to your business.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I think the term and the way you talk about that too is so important. I think especially us, and maybe in the DevOps space here, we try to focus on like, who are the people that do the best. Like, like I read, and I'm sure you do, like your books and Gene Kim's books, and I hold up these organizations that do these crazy things. But it's like, if you're working at a bank, or like I work at an insurance company, the pace of change is different depending on the industry you're in. And I think, kind of like, as you mentioned, that context, we have to know the context and apply it correctly, don't we?
And you've got to, what we really want to do is get people on a journey of continuous improvement. And if we start with a vision that's so far from the reality they check out, are we doing ourselves a service? So, I would imagine your insurance company, there's some large, tightly coupled systems that integrate and release together.
A few.
We could say, we could say that these loosely coupled teams that deploy thousands of times a day are much better and more efficient, and so everybody should do DevOps. I will tell you that that re-architecture to decouple that's going to be a long, hard journey. But if you just apply some principles about continuous improvement and how to analyze your process, there is more waste and inefficiencies in these large, tightly coupled systems than are ever there for small teams. And yes, if you can re-architect for small teams, ideally, less complexity, much better, easier, faster. The reality is that re-architecture change is just out of the realm of reality for most organizations. And there are some huge opportunities for improvements before you even take that on. And then once you get more efficient with a good deployment pipeline up and going, then maybe you can start to make evolutionary changes to your architecture to decouple things over time. But I'm not sure that's the first place I'd start for a large decoupled system or large tightly coupled system.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of reminds me, I don't know if you've seen the movie, What About Bob? And he has the term baby steps. He talks about baby steps as his psychologist tells him. So it's kind of funny, but in the technology industry, I think, we sometimes think, you and me might think of quantum leaps where we're going to make huge changes. But when we talk to, maybe it's an executive or somebody on one of, like you mentioned, a mainframe team, we have to work on those baby steps to get that change and continuous improvement, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Locked up. And even, I go to organizations like, well, we could start this and we could make some continuous improvement. We could get teams like, no, we need a 3-year transformation of a scale transformations. Have you seen hit on schedule and deliver the benefits that you thought would be there? And do you spend 9 months planning, or do you spend 9 months getting people to make small little steps in the right direction? I'm a little more. And do you want to have some large consulting organization do it for you? Or do you want to teach your people how to do it for themselves and learn and make visible their processes?
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. So I just want to make sure everyone knows, I see we have some people watching us. Feel free to drop questions in the chat. As I mentioned, there's a Google form there. You go ahead, fill that out. Gary's going to give away one copy. I know he mentioned also to a white paper he's going to share with everyone who registered. So he'll email that to me and we'll share that with you. So feel free to, like I said, ask any questions. But Gary, as you mentioned, you kind of have gone through an evolution as you've written books. So talk to us. I'm guessing you've probably, as you work with other organizations now, maybe you're thinking about a new book or maybe a different tact, a way of kind of looking at things.
I've shifted. I mean, my first book was a case study of what we did at HP. My second book was everything I wish I knew before I went from HP to Macy's and tried to replicate it. And it was everything I wished I knew before I started doing this again. And because there just aren't a lot of resources for executives. And then my third book was just as I started consulting. And then my fourth book, I really got frustrated watching people struggle to deliver the results that I knew were possible. And it really was about how do we come up with a systematic approach for continuous improvement for software? Manufacturing's been doing it for decades and decades and fine-tuned it. And I heard a lot of people saying, oh, no, we should just do exactly what we did in manufacturing. I was like, no, I grew up in manufacturing. It's done that way for a reason, and software is very different. I learned that and trying to continuous improve at HP. And my latest thing is here's what they did in manufacturing and why. Here's how software is different. Here's what we can learn from them, but here's what we need to do to take advantage of unique characteristics and capabilities of software. And here's how you can apply it. And I did that. I rolled the book out and it had some decent sales and was going. But I started going to organizations that were trying to transform. And my assumption was, well, they'd buy a bunch of books and everybody would read the books and come together and align on how to make the process visible and how to get going on a continuous improvement journey. And what I realized in working with a lot of large organizations is that's just not realistic to make that happen. So I turned a lot of the book into a computer-based training program that enables you to get a white belt certification in engineering the digital transformation. And it's really about giving people a common framework to analyze their process, a way to make the process visible, a way to analyze your specific problem, to identify the problems that are addressing you the most. And then on the back end of that, helping you come up with metrics, not that what I came to the conclusion is I can't measure the productivity of software, but as I'd worked with a lot of different organizations, I can measure the waste that's slowing down flow. Whether it's you're having to debug and triage deployment issues or environment issues or a bunch of things that can and should be automated out of the system, or your feedback delay to the engineers is so slow they're not learning and getting better. They're checking in code and weeks later they're getting feedback. Those are the types of the branching. How many branches do you have? How much duplicate work? There's a lot of things that you can measure that are waste and inefficiencies in software. And I frame that into it. And so enabling people to train on how to analyze it, pick something within their zone of acceptance and something that they're passionate about fixing, train and help them learn and understand how to make an improvement, and then quantify that improvement in dollars in such a way that enables them to go to the business and say, hey, thanks for letting me do this investment. Let me show you how much waste and inefficiencies I've removed. And I've got people working on their Greenbelt projects, and first couple are coming in with $50,000-$60,000 of annual savings a year.
Wow.
And so if you let people pick, they pick their own thing, they can quantify it. It's not a productivity measurement, but it is a measure of value that you can show the organization, and you can make the process visible and they can work through that. So it seems to be working. I have some organizations that have just built it into their employee development model. It would be a level this engineer, you got to pass a white belt to get to a level this level, you got to get a green belt, and then you got to get black belt. And it seems to be working for them more than coming in and saying, do this because it worked for that group.
So it's a little more self-directed, it sounds like, Gary, where you're kind of letting, like you mentioned, people pick something they're passionate about, as opposed to, executive A saying, okay, Tom, we want your group and you guys to go look at this, right?
Well, a lot of those are frameworks based around what worked for somebody else. And what we're trying to do is force people into that behavior, whether it's through metrics or whether it's through, you got to do this because we're rolling it out this way, and you measure compliance. And what Jonah Berger says is that's the worst thing you can be doing for organization change management, because as soon as you start trying to influence and force people, their anti-persuasion radar is going to come out, and they may check the boxes and they may do the things, but they're not really going to own embracing the new ways of working and making that happen.
Yeah, I think that you've mentioned a couple times here the anti-persuasion radar. I think I've seen that in action, and I've probably pushed people a bit and brought that out because, as you mentioned, it's important to, get something that they're willing to accept, but that's an important aspect, isn't it, Gary?
Yeah, and what he tells you is while you're trying to influence all the right things and do the right things, the harder you push, the harder they'll dig in. Measure your maturity at doing the right way is just going to force people to dig in and resist that change. So let's teach them, let's train them how to think about development delivery as a process that can and should be continually improved. And then let's reward them for taking on an improvement project and removing waste from their organization.
Yeah.
If you could get everybody in your insurance organization, even if you could get 50% of the people to take white belt and 10% of the people do an improvement project, and each improvement project saved you $50,000-$60,000 in waste a year, do you think your insurance company would be moving a lot faster and a lot quicker?
Yeah. Yeah, and those numbers might get some people's attention.
Which enables you to do your next improvement. Right now they're saying, well, gee, should I invest for this big DevOps transformation? Well, I don't know, what is DevOps, everything. And then they have these ideas around what these things are that may not be really practical for them, and so it enables them to put it in their zone of non-acceptance. Right? It's too far away from them to accept, and so you give them all these reasons why they can reject it, and and they're not going to be very successful that way.
Yeah, and I want to bring it back to that. You talked about quantifying, the result or the projected result, and I think that's something I know. I want to raise my hand and say I've not done that many times in my technical career. And as you talk to executives, and I know you talk to a lot of executives, and that gets their attention. And I didn't realize that a few times, and I know. I think sometimes this in technology, there's even kind of a feeling that we want to avoid that. We don't want to talk numbers, or we don't understand that. That's so important, isn't it, Gary, to understand, like, if we want to suggest a change, to have that be able to quantify the result.
If you want to continue on a continuous improvement journey, you've got to convince people the value of what you're doing. And if you can't do that in some hard, tangible way, if you're just saying, well, we did Agile really well, and we did this maturity model of Agile, and let me tell you how mature these different groups are in terms of being Agile or being DevOps or any of those sorts of things, they're going to go, well, yeah, that's great. And some people are going to get on board, and they're going to, yeah, we're all doing DevOps, and this is good, and that different type of thing. But others are going to reject it, and you need to talk to them on something that makes sense. And, software for years has looked at, how do I measure productivity? And is it lines of code? Well, I can game that system. Is it stories? I can game that system. Tell me how you're going to measure me, and I'll tell you how I'm going to game. And what I realized is, after a while, you really can't measure productivity for software because everything's a different shape and different size. But we can measure the waste that's slowing down flow. And if engineers are spending X amount of their time debugging and triaging environment issues that aren't associated with the code that they checked in, that's clearly waste.
Yeah.
And if we can fix that either by gating the quality of code that's coming into a large, tightly coupled system, or fixing environment. I've had organizations that had, they'd run 20,000 automated tests a week, and they'd look at it and said, and as a team in India run the tests, and the team in the US develop the code. It's like, well, why don't you run them more often? He goes, well, they run in like 4 hours. So it's like, well, let's run them multiple times a day. He's like, I can't. I spend all week long debugging and triaging these tests to figure out which ones are true failures and which ones aren't. It's like, well, what's going on there? He goes, well, my environment size is too small. It doesn't have enough memory and enough CPU, so all my tests are timed out. So the ones that fail, I got to keep running them to see like, hello, wait a minute. Could somebody get this individual a bigger test environment that's more powerful so that you don't see those things until you start looking into them and analyzing. That doesn't come up. But I would imagine if you went into one of your large, tightly coupled systems in your insurance company and you took all your automated tests and you ran them 20 times in a row, there'd be a bunch that were flaky.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I've had that conversation with people.
And what's the reaction?
It's kind of like what you were talking about before. We have these environments that aren't provisioned correctly. We have, and the resources the way things are set up, it's kind of, I don't want to get into the internal politics of it, but there's some things where you try to influence change, but you have to be careful of that, like we talked about before, quantifying the result, but then two, you kind of have to be, sometimes we still in this world have, even though we've talked about things like DevOps, we still have some silos. And so you have to be careful about some of those. So it's a kind of like walking a tightrope sometimes.
Yeah, but what you're doing when you run those automated tests in that integrated test environment, you're either teaching engineers to ignore failures because they know it's not related to their code, or they're wasting a bunch of time debugging and triage stuff that isn't associated with them. Fixing that is where you save yourself tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year.
Yeah. Yep.
And if you had, let's try this experiment. You had 4 executives that were kind of in charge of that integrated test environment that were over different parts of it. If you could talk 4 of them into taking the white belt training, I'll send you a free coupon for those 4. And they can try it, and after they take the training, see if they get aligned. The other thing that I've had some clients doing is they actually take it together. Even when people are at home, they do a Zoom together. And the training takes like 6 to 8 hours, and it takes longer if they take it together because they stop to argue. But when they stop to argue is when they start to get aligned.
Yeah. It kind of starts a conversation, right, Gary?
Yeah, they stop. Well, gee, we're doing this wrong. No, we're doing this right. No, wait, well, that's really wrong. Well, okay, well, let's get some data. So and at the end of each module, they stop and they argue about what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. And then at the end of it, they've had enough of those discussions that they are closer to agreeing on what some of the top things are. And maybe they need to go collect some data to prove it and have it out so you show the improvements. But the hardest part I found is getting people in a position of influence in the organization to take the time to take the training. Because it's a big investment and it's hard, and it's, I've had people who've studied my stuff for years and gone on my webinars say, boy, that was really hard. I learned a lot. And my comment was, well, that's great. I'm glad you learned a lot, and I'm glad it was hard because my problem with software certifications is there's no rigor with it. So I want to make sure there was some rigor and it was meaningful. But the other side of it was not what if you, Tom, had this level of knowledge, but what if 40% of your organization had that common set of knowledge and a common framework for talking about things? You
Yeah.
think you'd go faster then?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a
That's
lot
true.
of the I'm working with a lot of people in dojo communities, and they've traditionally brought in one team at a time. And what they're realizing is that doesn't scale very well, and they're still spending a lot of their time convincing people that they should do things different.
Yeah.
And with this training, you can sprinkle it around, and then the dojo team can stay focused on the teams that were passionate enough to come to them and want to do an improvement project
Yeah.
instead of them trying to convince the organization to change.
Excellent. Excellent stuff, Gary. We appreciate your time so much. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I want to thank you for sharing your time. And of course, thank you for giving away a copy of Engineering the Digital Transformation. I know we have some people here in the chat and some people watching, but I know some people are going to be one lucky person is going to receive a copy. And I know you mentioned you too have a white paper. So I just want to thank you for spending your valuable time with us, Gary, here on the DevOps Online Meetup. Make sure to join us. We have on June 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern, we have one feature at a time with Brendan O'Reilly. So I'm going to post the link in the chat. We have an Eventbrite. So, but Gary, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and appreciate it. Hopefully you have a good rest of your day. I know you're out. What did you say? You're out in Arizona now?
Yeah, I was supposed to be in a hotel and I got kicked out of that and arranged with. So I'm in a parking lot in Page, Arizona, looking down at the Lake Powell. So
Cool.
yeah,
Well, hopefully you can enjoy the scenery some more this afternoon.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for listening, and best of luck on your journeys. And if you have questions or just want to chat about what's going on specifically in your organization, send me an email at gary@garygruver.com, and maybe we can chat and I can help you avoid some common mistakes, or maybe you can help me learn more about things that are working really well in your organization that I can share with others.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you in a few days.